The Native American story in Newbury is a very, very interesting one and a very complicated one, because when the first settlers arrived in 1635, there were very few Native people that were still in the area. They'd been suffering from European diseases brought down by previous settlers and trappers. Although in this area there certainly were contacts made before the first settlements in 1635, and Native people had suffered tremendously as a result. So most of the Native people in this area were very happy to have the company and protection of settlers, although again, it's a very complicated issue. There was still a fear. There was always a fear. They really saw the Native people as just a combination of animals and agents of the devil. And yet, in many cases, they were very friendly and made accommodations for the livelihood of Native people in the area. It's very complicated. There was always an undercurrent of threat. There was always a fear that at some point relations with Native Americans in the area were going to go bad and things were going to happen. But at the beginning of settlement, relations with Native people in this area were pretty positive. In fact, when the town lots were reallocated in 1643 in the town of Newbury, there were lots that were set aside for there's a lot set aside for a man named John Indian. So there is a member of the community who gets a house lot along and in the middle of all the other settlers in the first allotment. So it wasn't until the end of the century, really, the King Philip's War and beyond, and in this area in particular, in the 1690s, when there were French allied Native tribes from elsewhere that were coming down to the area and raiding, that people really started being terrified. And of course, as soon as King Philip's War breaks out, everybody in Newbury, men and from the families that are living in what is then West Newbury, are going off to fight, having just horrific encounters with, battles with Native people. Settlements are being raided, women and children are being kidnapped and dragged away, people are being scalped. There's all kinds of torture stories, and it's a very, very, very frightening time. Think about all of the incredible community stress that sort of helped to lead to the Salem witch trials in 1692. It's a very fearful time. So there was always a watch posted at the meeting house. They were always afraid that there was going to be an attack, and of course, what better time to attack a town than when everyone is in one building? So there was always a watch posted on Old Town Hill in Newbury. And there were garrison houses that were located along the Bradford Road. As far as I can tell, none of the original watch houses still exist. They tended to be log structures rather than brick structures, although there were later houses that were closer to Haverhill that were built of brick, in particular because they were, you couldn't burn them down as easily. By the 1690s, even though King Philip's War was long over, settlers of Newbury had been guarding against Native attacks since they first settled in 1635. The attack that they had all been anticipating since the beginning came to fruition in 1695 at the home of the Brown family off of Turkey Hill near the top of what's now Rogers Street in West Newbury. And it was a terrible scene. The man of the house had left with a load of turnips with his son to go to the market, leaving his wife Ruth with their 6 children and several other family members. And their house was attacked and they were taken. And the remarkable thing about this episode to me is how quickly, without the benefit of cell phones and radios or modern communications, how quickly the people of Newbury rallied and got together to try to rescue the members of the Brown family that had been taken. And in particular, there's an amazing letter that goes between Colonel Daniel Pierce, who's the head of the militia in Newbury, and Colonel Appleton, who's the head of the militia in Ipswich, where he says, "Sir, today the enemy came into our town." And it gives me goosebumps just saying it now. It really was this thing that they had been anticipating, and now it had happened, and it was terrible. And they knew, or they believed, that if this raiding party got across the Merrimack River with their captives, that they would never see them again. And they had reason to believe that that was true. And so they formed search parties, and they found them hiding just short of the Merrimack River. And we know a lot about that episode in Newbury's history. because one of the rescuers was injured during the rescue and later went into court to ask for basically for disability and described the entire episode in court. So sometimes you get your most interesting information from unlikely sources. At any rate, the Brown family story, while it was a sad one, did result in the rescue of several of the Brown family members. The closer you got to Haverhill, the more chance there was that you were going to be in some trouble, and the more guarded people tended to be about their neighborhood. Whenever you were in the outlying areas, and certainly West Newbury was an outlying area, you had to worry about your family and your isolated farmstead being attacked and carried away or killed, and your livelihood destroyed. So there were guardhouses. During the 1690s, there were 30 soldiers that were stationed along the Bradford Road in what is now West Newbury. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but that was a significant portion of the militia at the time, and they were in these log constructed guardhouses along the Bradford Road. So people were very concerned in the 1690s. And they had good reason to be. What you find more often in the court records of anywhere in Newbury is incidents that are more like cultural clashes with a hint of threat. You have women who would go into court and say that two native men had come to their house and seemed to be drunk and really frightened them. And whether the threat was real or whether the threat was implied, it still felt very real to these women. And sometimes they would go into court because there were native people who had been drinking or had been misbehaving in a variety of ways. But again, it's complicated because on the one hand, there is this threat from people that are surrounding you every day that may be real or may be the product of your cultural bias. And then there's the very, very real threat of native groups that are allied with the French and are coming down and raiding outlying areas and doing really, horrific violence on the people that they encounter. And Newbury men and their families who had moved to York, Maine, who had moved to Haverhill, were the subject of terrible violence by native groups. There is the story of Indian Hill and Hananiah Ordway, where in the early 1700s, Hananiah Ordway, who was a settler, you can see his house on some early maps, he shot an Indian that he said, I shot an Indian that was skulking around my house. And the Indian was never found. The body was never found. It's an interesting story, and it was, it's worthy of a plaque, I guess, up on Indian Hill. But as far as I can tell in the record, it's a fairly isolated incident and may have just been someone trying to do a little burglary rather than an actual attack. It's hard to say.
Or plain old fake news.
Or plain old fake news. It could have been old Hananiah Ordway trying to make himself look tough.